But I want to talk to you tonight about communion. And so if you want to turn to 1 Corinthians 11, let's talk about communion. What about this ordinance we practice in the church called communion? By the way, I'm really kind of messing things up. You notice we didn't have communion before, and we're doing it a little bit different tonight. And I guess as old as I am and as long as I've been here, sometimes I just mix things up. So that's what we're going to do. So what about this ordinance we practice in the church called communion? Why do we religiously continue this ritual? Sometimes we need to rebuild pillars in the church and remind ourselves as to why we do certain things. That's the way traditions are born, friends. We just keep doing something, but we don't understand what the meaning is behind it. So I thought it was important for us to go back and build the pillar again and understand why we do worship. As a matter of fact, this is one of the messages that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. Since we have the Lord's table, which that's what is before me, communion is another word, or the Eucharist, whatever term we want to use, it's a good idea to re-educate ourselves. I want to look at communion from the context of what Paul wrote to the Corinthians about this discipline in the church. What I would like us to discover is this is a letter from a founding pastor to his people, much like a dad would read or write a letter to his kids. I think sometimes what we do in the Western world is we have a mindset to study something to the point that we dissect it, that we don't even understand the meaning behind it. If I sent a letter to you, or you sent one to me and we were close friends, or an email or whatever it might be, I wouldn't dissect every little word and wondering why you used an and there or a why there. I would first try to understand the spirit behind it and get a meaning from it. And I think sometimes we're just guilty in the Western world of dissecting too much of the truth when it's just supposed to be written and understood as a letter to us, as Paul said to this. Paul is dealing with real issues in the church and is writing back to try to give people in everyday life situations some direction. Paul is handling situations where people prefer one pastor over another. I mean, when you read this in Corinthians, you'll find out that there are people there that says, I like Paul. I like Apollos. I like Peter. Or I even like Jesus. And there's divisions that are being caused by that. Now, friends, I need to say something about this situation that we find ourselves in. You're going to find me up here about 60 to 70% of the time. But we do have a teaching team. And one is not better than the other. And that's exactly the situation that Paul was dealing with in those days. I want to be here for a long run. I don't know how long that will be, but I know if I'm here every weekend, it's not going to be that long. He was dealing with issues, okay? There are lawsuits, believers taking other believers to court, marriage and divorce problems, immorality and divisions in the church. I'm reading into the text, but I believe Paul hits a point and just out of almost nowhere begins to talk about the Lord's table. It's like, what's going to bring us back on the same page? I think what Paul is trying to say is what will bring us back to a fresh start. What will happen in our lives if we begin to understand that there are fresh starts as we move through this thing called life? People are in pain. Anybody here in pain? You don't have to raise your hand. I know you are. Life has become confusing and difficult, and Paul's focus becomes, how do I put all this on the table? And friends, when I wrote that out, I thought, maybe I shouldn't put it on the table. But that's exactly what it is. Coming to the Lord's table, and we're going to put it on the table. We're going to understand that the Lord's going to invite us to a place to put this stuff that we're going through. I read a book. And this author just really kind of grabbed my attention. And he suggested that the canon of the church or the canon of the scriptures maybe would have been best if it started out with Job. And if you don't know what the canon is, it's not something to do with military. That's the way the Bible is put together, and they call that the canon of the scriptures. And he is saying, because Job is the oldest book in the Bible, probably written by Moses, that secondly, the most important thing for him anyway, is that the reason that it should be at the first of the Bible is because God wanted to speak to us that life is going to have its difficulties and its pain. And none of us are ever going to escape that. That communion reminds us, now get a hold of this, of a God that is not way out there someplace, but has actually entered into the realm of our suffering. That's the kind of leader we have. He has come to this place and he says, I'm not just somebody out there that thinks about your pain. I've actually entered into it. There's such a connection with other people who have suffered along the same lines as you have. You ever notice that? When somebody sits down and let's say, for instance, they're a cancer survivor and you're going through cancer, there's an immediate connection there simply because that person has experienced what you're going through. I mean, I've noticed these connections for I don't know how long. In people's life, when you've gone through an experience, and I love this phrase, God never wastes a pain, that when you go through something and then you're able to identify with somebody that's just going through that valley, there's a connection there. And when God invites us, now friends, think about this. The first time that communion was ever really celebrated as far as the Lord's presence, and when he did it with the 12 disciples, it was about him sharing his pain that he was about ready to suffer when he went on the cross. So they were sitting around this thing, and it's almost like when we come down here in a few minutes and we're going to take of the cup and we're going to take of the bread, what the Lord is saying is, I want you to put it on the table. I want you to talk to me what's going on in your life. Communion is just one of those things where it is so private, so intensely intimate, that it's a time when you, even though we're in this gathering with a lot of people tonight, it's a time for us to really say we can put it on the table because we understand that this God that we serve knows the pain and the process of our life. And so that's what he invites us to. He wants us to understand that. It's not some form of a magic rabbit's foot. Please hear this. You know, because if we take of the Lord's table tonight, doesn't necessarily mean that all of your problems are going to go away. And he never promised that at all. But he did say this, I will be with you in your problems. And I want to talk about that with my last point. I will be with you in your problems. And here's a point that I'd really like to just kind of put out there for you to think about. You know, we're all priests. Every one of us are priests. And it doesn't take you to come to this church to participate in communion. You can do it on your own. And sometimes you and I just have to develop the practice on our own when we're going through difficult times, that maybe we ought to just kind of set out the bread and the juice and just saying, God, I need to know that you're with me. And have a time of communion on your own and recognize that God's with you. So I'm going to give you some thoughts about communion. Number one is this. Communion draws us towards humility. Verse 23, Paul says this, for I received from the Lord, and I want you to just notice this, for I received from the Lord. Paul makes the point that this ordinance was received from the Lord, which means it was something that was a choice. This is kind of interesting. Every one of us, when we go through situations, we choose what we're going to receive as far as mental comfort, emotional comfort, or whatever the case might be. And our minds are absolutely drawn sometimes or often away from the problem. It could even be called denial. It doesn't really matter. The point of it is that when we're in a lot of pain, what we try to do is we try to focus on something that will try and get us out of that pain. And that's probably pretty much the normal pattern of how people deal with when they're going through painful situations. So when it comes to communion, you have to understand that this is something that you have to receive. Now, it's one thing to receive something good that kind of tickles the emotions, but it is quite another thing to think about and receive something that doesn't tickle the emotions. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up as a child and receiving communion, one of the thoughts that went through my mind was this: why do we have to think about something that is so terrible? I don't know if that has ever struck you, but it's not exactly the thing you want to come and just prep yourself up about when you think about somebody's death and the horrible death that the Lord took upon himself. I've only watched The Passion of the Christ one time. And you know why? Because it brings up such raw emotions that I don't think I can handle it. It's not something that I really want to see again. And yet Paul is saying to us, I received this from the Lord. And there is something that transcends our minds, our emotions, our will, and maybe even our own being when we look upon the suffering of the Lord that puts us in a place that produces humility. Because all of us come to recognize, and most people that I've talked to that watch The Passion of the Christ, they come to this point, they recognize, it was my sin that put him up there. And there is just something so moving in that brings us to a point that we recognize, I'm being humbled. Why am I being humbled? Now think about this, friends. The most powerful thing that God could ever do to bring us to a point of humility is to bring us to this place of the cross and saying, if you will receive what I did upon the cross, it will bring you to a place of humility. And then we find out in the scriptures, God resists the proud, but he gives what? Grace to the humble. See, here's the whole point of what God wants to do through communion. He wants to bless you. He wants to bless me. And we, here's a point that nobody had to go to pride school. We learned it all naturally. But God presents something to our mind, and so you and I have to sit here and ask ourselves, do I want to receive mentally? Do I want to receive in my spirit what Jesus did on the cross for me? And if we do, then there's a first step to real blessing in our life because humility is produced. Number 2 is this. God meets us in our brokenness. God meets us in our brokenness. Now notice I didn't use the word strength, but he meets us in our brokenness. Verse 24, he broke it. I want you to notice Jesus said he broke it, speaking specifically of his body. It was a choice to be broken. Now think about this. No one ever forced Jesus to give up his life. Matter of fact, he said that. No one takes my life from me. I give it willingly. Now, I want you to think about this concept here, friends, because I think this is a huge one. That we will never, ever, in my opinion, for the rest of eternity, understand the chasm between God and man. I mean, we are finite beings, and God is infinite, but that chasm that Jesus stepped out of Godship and came and made himself a man is such a wide chasm that I don't think anybody will ever comprehend it. And that's, and here's the point, is that God had to get on our level. Jesus had to come and get on our level, and we just don't know how low he stooped. But he stooped really low so that he could meet us where we were. But it takes us beyond that. And as I was studying it this last couple of weeks, I really began to realize that he even went a step further. And the step further is I will not only join you as a human being, but I will join you in your brokenness. I will meet you where you are broken. Not in your strengths, but in your brokenness. That's where I will meet you. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul compares we human beings to earthen vessels. Did a little study on earthen vessels, and it's really interesting that earthen vessels in those days were everyday plates that you and I would use today. And they were made cheaply, and they broke easily, very easily. Which means this, any kind of pressure that was put on them, they broke. And Jesus says, I came and was broken so that I can meet you in your brokenness. Now, friends, let me just say this to you. If you're in a place today where you've got your act together and you're pretty strong and you've hit a stride in your life that everything is going well, I bless you. I think that is absolutely wonderful. And I'm not a purveyor or a pastor or a preacher of bad news, but I want you to know someday your day is going to come. And it's going to happen. And you know what breaks in a human being? It's our humanity. And for one reason or another in the church, we want to deny our humanity. We don't want to do, and it seems to be that Jesus is saying, I know what flesh is all about. I know what brokenness is all about. And the one place that we can really be real is where Jesus says, I'll meet you in the place of your brokenness. That I can be open about what I'm broken. See, intensely intimate between you and the Lord, but the Lord gets it. I understand you're broken. And all I can say to you is, friends, it happens. He meets us in our weakness. We don't want anybody to see our humanity or our brokenness, but Jesus says, I want to give, and this is, here's the big thing about it, is that when we break, and it's the best deal in town, friends. I've thought about this for a long time, and I've used this before. It's the best deal in town because nobody wants your ashes, but Jesus says, bring them to me. I'll give you beauty for ashes. I'll give you something that you don't have when we exchange what our broken is. Number 3 is this. We see ourselves just like other people. This is really an interesting point that I think that Paul makes. Without recognizing the body. Verse 29. See, we need to come in and examine ourselves. And then he says, I want you to recognize the body. Paul says, I want you to recognize the people in the church for who they are. The longer I live, the more I realize how much people face the very same things that other people endure or deal with. When you get below the surface, you go, oh, you're experiencing life too. It's like my counselor that told me here, and I shared it with you a few months back. She says, oh, I see. You see yourself swimming in the sea of humanity like everyone else. You see, at some point, we all get to that place that we recognize we're pretty much like everybody else. Or we have a tendency to think, and when we get to this place that we look at people, we have 2 different types of attitudes that really start taking place in our life. Number 1 is this. We have a tendency to look at people and think, if I only had their life, then I would really be happy. Any of you ever had that thought? We look at people and go, they've got it together, which shows us we probably really don't know them that well. Or we have this other thought that runs through our minds, and this is probably more of the normal thought that I would think that is just in people, and it goes something like this. I'm glad I'm not like them. Which is this, friends, is basically saying is I'm elevated just a little bit more. I'm just a little bit better than. See, I was in a conversation quite some time ago with an individual, and they were telling me about how they were raised in a faith, in a certain kind of faith, and a Christian faith, what we would call as a different denomination. And during the course of the conversation, they were telling me how they had really experienced the Lord and had